Good morning everyone, my name is Alison Cairns and welcome to today's presentation on the impact of food insecurity on the health of the Greenland Norse. It's just an outline of what I'll be discussing today. So the concept of food security is flexible and has evolved over time, reflecting changes in policy thinking, research and politics. The United Nations World Food Programme defines it in that people are considered food secure when they have availability and adequate access at all times to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. There are three elements to food security, including food availability, access, and utilization. Food security can be impacted by a number of environmental factors, and our current food systems are particularly vulnerable to these. So who were the Greenland Norse, and why are they important? The Norse settled in three locations along the Greenland fjords from around 985 AD. The Greenland ancestors of the Inuit, arrived around 1200 AD. The Norse arrived during the medieval warm period, which would have been an optimal time for agriculture in a location that was, and still is, a harsh environment, particularly for crop growing. However, this was followed by the Little Ice Age from around the 13th century onwards, which resulted in glacial advances and cooler summer temperatures. This had a significant impact on food security for the Greenland Norse. Research into this period has consistently pointed to food insecurity as the main factor in driving the abandonment of Greenland by the Norse, which occurred from the mid-14th to 15th centuries. So I'm just going to quickly discuss the environmental drivers that led to food insecurity for the Greenland Norse. So the Greenland Norse were known to utilize traditional Norwegian subsistence practices, including crop growing and livestock raising. Environmental drivers, which occurred as a result of the Little Ice Age, resulting in food insecurity, would have included semi-permanent ice cover from the 14th century onwards, coastal drowning, glacial advancement, a reduction in temperature, and increased regularity of waters freezing around Greenland. This would have had an impact on damaging crops, affecting growth, inhibiting winter grazing, shortening hunting and growth times, and reducing opportunities for trade. There is also evidence on several farms of overgrazing, clearing and burning of shrublands, which would have further contributed to vulnerability of the land to environmental impacts and thus the ability to raise crops for subsistence and to feed livestock. I'd just like to take the opportunity now to use the next few slides to discuss the physical and mental health impacts on the Greenland Norse from this food insecurity and recommendations. We know that food security directly impacts on health and can lead to a number of short and long-term consequences, many of which are linked to one another, and have a great framework which has been taken from the article by Black et al. And food insecurity is highlighted in that, along with a number of other causes of undernutrition. We will discuss these health challenges in the context of the Greenland Norse and what they likely experienced as a result of the increasing food insecurity. So the first we have under morbidity is malnutrition. So malnutrition leads to a heightened risk of disease and death, and in this particular case is due to deficiencies in a person's uptake of energy or nutrients. Mammal bones from Greenland from this time show the Norse exploited almost all of the fat from these bones, indicating subsistence stress. The idea that they experience nutritional stress is also supported by the presence of evidence for stress during growth periods in a skeletal sample from Greenland. Malnutrition in this population would have been due to impaired or damaged crops and reduced livestock yields, and this would have led to a shortage of food as well as a lack of nutrient diversity. Protein-calorie malnutrition is also a common cause of secondary immune deficiency and susceptibility to infection. Otitis media, or middle ear infection, is common in skeletal material from Greenland, and this has been linked to undernutrition in modern samples. Tuberculosis is also linked to malnutrition and may have been a more significant problem in the Greenland Norse given the malnutrition, presence of cattle which are a vector, and the cold temperatures. A number of other impacts are likely to have been experienced by the Greenland Norse, which are directly impacted by malnutrition. Those are chronic health issues and also growth implications, so in regards to both cognitive and physical growth. Finally, increased mortality is likely to have been experienced amongst the Greenland Norse, particularly in younger children who would have been made more susceptible through the effects of malnutrition, but it's likely that there was increased adult and infant mortality. So research also suggests that food insecurity is significantly associated with poor mental health and depression, and that it is a mentally and emotionally damaging experience. Due to the impacts of climate change on agriculture and trade, poor mental health is likely to have occurred amongst the Greenland Norse. We also know that a connection to land is an incredibly important part of many Indigenous cultures, as are traditional subsistence practices. Forced changes in their traditional practices, including to crop growing and cattle raising as depicted in this image, could have changed the way the Norse viewed the landscape, their place in it, and contributing to heightened levels of mental and social stress. So I'll now be discussing the recommendations, and they'll be based on the Sustainable Development Principles. So in looking at the Greenland Norse, the lessons we can learn from them and placing it in a modern context, there's a need to address the root or upstream causes of food insecurity to mitigate these health impacts, rather than just looking at the issue at its endpoint. The United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition calls for action across 6 key areas, including creating sustainable, resilient food systems for healthy diets, and it's also one of the Sustainable Development Goals. These highlight the importance of participatory and multidisciplinary approaches. So the first is utilisation of traditional and subsistence practices and knowledge. Early adaptation to the traditional practices of the Thule, which involved a diet based predominantly on marine protein, could have helped the Greenland Norse population protect themselves against the negative health impacts of these changes by preventing malnutrition. We do know that they adapted, with bioarchaeological evidence indicating a distinct shift to a diet higher in marine protein, but this may have come too late. As covered in Principle 22, in a modern context, involvement of Indigenous populations and their knowledge in subsistence and land management is acknowledged by many to be vital in ensuring food security through reducing vulnerability to environmental changes. This knowledge should be incorporated into land management and agricultural practices, and intergenerational transfer of knowledge should be encouraged. Agricultural biodiversity is also something that the Greenland Norse could have participated in, and that's an important lesson for us to learn in a modern context. The principle that applies here states that to achieve sustainable development and a higher quality of life, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. From the current evidence, it is not clear if the Greenland Norse participated in activities that support agricultural biodiversity, though from archaeological evidence it is unlikely that they grew any crops other than barley, and therefore didn't participate in practices such as crop rotations and mixed cropping. In a modern context, it is argued that a participatory approach involving the knowledge of local farmers and Indigenous people in the application of techniques that promote sustainable agriculture and biodiversity should be applied to mitigate the impacts of food insecurity on health. So these techniques, such as agroforestry, crop rotations and mixed cropping, amongst others, help to mitigate the issues of malnutrition generally through resilience to change and improving crop yields, but also contribute to nutritional diversity, lessening the impact of food insecurity on nutritional deficiencies. Following on from this, we have protecting ecosystems. Food security is dependent on ecosystem services, but is also the greatest contributor to loss of ecosystem services and biodiversity. We know that the Greenland Norse likely contributed to soil erosion, which would have further increased vulnerability of the land to climate change. Lack of incorporation of environmental protection and thinking about future generations, which directly ties into Principles 3 and 4, demonstrates the need for the environment to be considered in land management policies and frameworks. Finally, we have a mitigation and adaptation to current and future climate change. The World Food Programme notes that climate change affects all aspects of food security and nutrition. There are key lessons we can learn from the experiences of the Greenland Norse. Precautionary actions to reduce the severity of climate change in modern times could have been undertaken some time ago in order to decrease the impacts of food security, and would have been a cost-effective measure compared to the large-scale food crises, particularly in those countries already experiencing high levels of hunger that will likely occur with modern climate change. Now we are beyond that principle. It is essential that adaptations are built into food systems, and as well as building agricultural resilience and resilience of people to adopt practices that enable vulnerable people to protect livelihoods, diversify sources of income, all of which will directly impact physical and mental health. Overlaying all of these is the idea of intergenerational equity. The development in agriculture must be undertaken in a way so that it will meet the needs of future generations. To conclude, food insecurity can have significant impacts on health, and it's likely that the GreenlandNorse experienced a number of these. Our recommendations include increasing resilience in agriculture and communities, protecting the environment, agricultural diversity, and promoting Indigenous knowledge. Climate change has had an impact on food security and human health throughout history and will continue to do so unless progress is made to prevent and mitigate its current and future impacts. And a few references for you.